I was really lucky to have 3 months of pure research time at the museum with the help of some of my supervisors, and I got to research a topic that I not only consider really interesting but really important. I got to read about midwives. But before I get to some of the fun parts, I am going to go over the agenda for tonight. I'm going to give you a brief introduction into what my research question was. Then I'm going to talk about social childbirth in the 19th century, about some of the relationships between doctors and midwives, technological developments with an emphasis on forceps, and then I'm going to briefly talk about the alternate birth movement and the home birth movement. As I mentioned before, I spent my summer at the Museum of Healthcare, reading about midwives and the history of midwifery in Canada. In case you didn't know, the Museum of Healthcare has a fantastic obstetrics collection that I used as a starting point for my research. I'm also incredibly lucky to have a lot of friends who have recently used midwives, and they've been really kind enough to share their stories with me and really inspire me to research this topic further. I know that my mother's generation, and yes, for the most part, I grew up in Romania, which is very different from the Canadian context, but I know she would have never considered using a midwife. And here I was, 2012, all of my friends having children using midwives. And it really got me thinking, what happened? How did we go from mostly using midwives to then mostly hospital-based birth to now, again, a resurgence in the number of midwives. So here's where we are today at 2012. More women trying to get access to midwives. Now let's take a look back at some of the developments and see how we got to this moment. Once I realized I wanted to learn more about midwifery, there were so many aspects I could focus on. I could read just about the relationship between midwives and doctors. I could read about the impact of forceps. I could even study the implications of legalization of midwifery in Ontario and the implications on the Canadian healthcare system. But as I started reading everything I could get my hands on, I realized there was one perspective I was missing, and that was that of the women themselves. Surely the development of obstetrical instruments as well as anesthesia, those were all really important factors, but I wanted to see how women's decisions and how women agency played a role in this whole story. And I had a hunch that maybe they had something to do with it, and I was hoping I wasn't wrong. And what I discovered is that society and women's culture in particular in the 19th and 20th centuries changed dramatically, and all these changes influenced women's experience of birth. While it is generally recognized that the midwife is one of the oldest and most respected female occupations, and without a doubt one of the more important ones, the focus of historical studies has been very much on this rivalry between midwives and doctors, and on the process of decline of the midwife in place of obstetrics work. And there's a lot of very black and white doctors versus midwives, and I thought it would be good to go beyond this dichotomy and look at some of the context and some of the factors that were some of the things that were happening in society at the time. Historians who have been critical of midwives have talked about their extreme intervention and their lack of skills. On the flip side, historians who are really sympathetic to midwives talk about their low-tech approach and this holistic approach to delivery. So as you can tell, there's two ways you can look at it, and I wanted to see if I could take a look at the bigger picture. Many people in the audience will be familiar with the stereotypical image of the Canadian midwife in society. She was this natural part of every community. She was known as the neighborhood midwife, the lay midwife, or the granny midwife. Until the 1850s, traditional midwives abounded all parts of Canada. Most were lay or empirical midwives that had come from First Nations communities, or we start seeing women moving from France and England, where there was a way stronger midwifery emphasis. Much of the knowledge about the practice of midwifery in the 19th century comes from physicians' casebooks, from newspaper articles, from diaries, and from letters. Based on these accounts, several scholars have argued that the practice of midwifery consisted of a neighborhood of women that were assisting each other during labor and delivery, as well as during the postpartum period. This knowledge about maternity care was usually transmitted informally and was based on women getting together and sharing information with each other. Often one or two women in the community were seen as having some sort of special skills, and in some cases they might have had formal training in England or in France and moved across to Canada. But traditional midwifery did not exist in the same way we understand professions today. There was no training. It mostly arose out of need. The picture was not always idyllic. The historical evidence illustrates that the provision of midwifery care was uneven at best. And the further away a woman got from a city or from a town center, the more difficult it was for her to get any sort of help during labor. A lot of women labored alone or relied on the help of their husbands or a friend, or in many cases they lived so far away they just could not get any sort of help. It was not always possible to get a trained midwife in Upper Canada, in which case, a neighbor would have to suffice. Starting in the 19th century, experienced midwives started to become available, and we see in newspapers advertisements for them, but usually those cost money, and not all the midwives had the means to advertise, and many of them didn't have to. They could just rely on word of mouth and their good reputation. Knowledge of birth and its associated dangers were, as I said, informally transmitted. That is, they formed part of this bigger birth culture, which women learned from participating in labor and giving birth themselves. And they would get together and be able to talk about all these things with their friends, maybe things they would not feel comfortable talking with their husbands. The birth was not only contained within this social sphere, it was also physical and symbolical. Once a woman went into labor and she sent her husband to get her neighbors and the family and a midwife, once they arrived on the scene, air was usually blocked by using a towel over the keyhole and at the door. Blinds would be pulled, candles would be lit, there's usually a symbolic beverage, and every midwife would have a different ritual. But once the baby was delivered and the umbilical cord was tied, it usually gave way to consistency, which meant the swaddling and presenting of the child to the mother. Despite all these really wonderful things about a social childbirth, all the neighbors and the family support, a romantic idea of childbirth in the 19th century would not be accurate. Women gathered all this support from their friends and their families, but at the same time they were still really scared of giving birth because there was a very good chance that themselves or their babies might not survive the experience. And it is precisely these fears that led women in the search for safer and, in their views, better ways to deliver. So women's experience of birth started to change with these three key factors. We've got changes in the place of birth, changes in the amount and the kind of intervention, and we've got changes in birth attendance. Despite the very real changes in technical and physical experience of birth, women's perceptions of its dangers and their ways of dealing with them within this female-centered environment remained very much the same while giving birth remained in the home. Helping each other during their birth experience enabled women to console and help each other. Childbirth customs formed a cornerstone of women's group identity and a sense of community, and midwives played such a crucial point because for women, giving birth was such an important event, and it was usually something that happened more than once in their lifetime. And this popular ceremony of childbirth both reflected and helped maintain a collective identity of women. the management of childbirth stood at the center of these activities, but represented more of a starting point and not just a boundary of practices. In order to understand the impact of some of these factors, it's important to see what happened in the 18th century. And we've got incredible agrarian improvements. We've got the move to large-scale farming, industrialization, urbanization, increase in prosperity, more population. All these amazing things were happening, and they had really big impacts on people's lives, and especially those of women. In the middle of the 18th century, women were still working with their husbands on the farms, but starting with the end of the 18th century, we see women not wanting to work in the fields as much and entering the parlor. Slowly, they started leaving behind them this, more lower class way of life, what they considered like being a farmer's wife, and started being interested in a leisurely life. And we start seeing what was called as a culture of the ladies. And in this context, we see the doctor appearing in affluent homes who could afford his fee. To avoid the gentility of his clients, at this point, doctors were using things like a modesty blanket to make sure, they wouldn't see the private parts of a woman. In many cases, he wouldn't even be touching them because there were so many concerns around what was proper and what was not. However, even after doctors entered the birthing chamber, midwives continued to flourish. Integral to the introduction of men into the birthing chamber was also this redefinition of childbirth. Before, childbirth was a natural event. It happened to all the women. You knew your friend who did it, your cousin. There were no problems. But all of a sudden, giving birth turned into a medical event, an event that was fraught with danger. Not that it wasn't before, it was always fraught with danger, and that now required the skills of a physician. The shift towards industrialization and the new relations of productions in North America were so influential in defining birth that it provided the metaphor of reproduction as a medicalized event. While physicians filled the roles of managers of birth, the traditional midwife started to be seen more as a craft person. In addition, at this point, we see gender ideals of women as frail and not being able to do things by themselves and needing assistance starting to take root, especially with the upper and middle classes. In Canada, this redefinition of childbirth was starting to have an effect. Assertions that it was incredibly dangerous and it required the assistance of a trained attendant, the emphasis on trained, spurred Lady ABERDEEN, the wife of the Governor General and the head of the newly formed National Council of Women, to propose the development of the Victorian Order of Home Helpers in 1897. And what Lady ABERDEEN recommended was that women who were already acting as midwives in their communities take a 6-month to 1-year course that was very broad. It included midwifery, general nursing, even table manners, and first aid, and things like self-control. That was one of my favorites. And many physicians came out strongly against this proposition because they felt that it would just send out a lot of nurses that would be inadequately trained, so it never really went anywhere. A lot of historians have written about the demise of the midwife in Ontario, especially in relation to doctors. But one cannot simply talk of the challenge of the man-midwife. In general terms, the midwife was more likely to suffer from the competition of a general practitioner who was now starting to get closer to women and wanted to get a foothold into basically what will become family practice. And, maybe for economic reasons, started taking more deliveries. But at the same time, the midwife's place of work was starting to change. Women's expectations of birth also started to change. The impositions of an increasingly technological culture needed to match these new expectations of women. Some wanted pain relief, Some wanted doctors, and eventually some of them wanted to deliver in a hospital. The rise of the man-midwife coincided with this profound switch in expectations, practices, and possibilities. The male emergency practitioner started being called a little earlier to deliver a living child. Previously, his task had been to save a mother's life, not necessarily that of a child. And this is why they're called man-midwife, a man who was expected, like the midwife, to deliver live births. And the man-midwife is basically the precursor of the OBGYN. As long as the male practitioner deployed any craniotomy devices, like you see on the screen, the realm of the live delivery belonged to the midwife. This entailed an inviolable boundary between the reality and female and male competencies. As a result, medical men regarded the office of the midwife with implicit respect. But once the physician could deliver a living child, that boundary was broken. In this moment of transition, emergency calls started being, a few to craniotomy cases, and then a few of them regular births. And what came into being was this new kind of practitioner. The doctor, the man who acted instead of a midwife, the physician who was now able to perform live births. And questions about the role of the man-midwife and his relationship with traditional midwives have been of particular interest in the past 20 years, as the medical management of childbirth has come increasingly under attack. Because midwives usually in the 19th century saw a very small caseload, usually 20 or fewer a year, which is very different from what it is today. It's something like 250 a year. Most midwives actually had very little experience managing difficult births. And when they were faced with failure to deliver, they would usually turn to a surgeon to save the mother. The call to a surgeon and then a midwife usually happened just in cases of emergency. And the call was usually delayed 3 or 4 days to make sure that the child had passed away, and then the surgeon would come in and perform a craniotomy. So what we see in the 19th century is this shift in choice of birth attendants. And there are two traditional explanations for this change. The first one is fashion, and the other one is forceps. Man-midwifery spread by process of fashion. At first, it was adopted at the top of the social sphere, and then it diffused downwards by process of emulation. And man-midwifery, by this argument, was like any other trend. However, this explanation ignores the fact that there was another alternative to the doctor, which was the midwife. The release of the forceps also seems to coincide with the rise of doctor-physician with doctor-assisted birth, because all of a sudden it enabled the male practitioner to deliver a live baby, where previously he was only able to deliver a dead one. On these grounds, the forceps has definitely played a crucial role. Yet many people have questioned this interpretation. The forceps were only useful in a small number of cases. Mothers usually disliked them and they were scared of them, like any new technology, and its misuse was one of the main reasons of its opposition. There were plenty of doctors at that time who did not think every doctor should use the forceps because they weren't being trained the same way they would be trained today, and skill differed greatly. To understand some of the impact of forceps, it'd be nice to know a little bit about their history, and these are the instruments you see on the screen are from the Museum of Healthcare's collection. The use of forceps peaked at the first half of the 20th century and has been decreasing since. The concept and the original design of the instrument belongs to the Chamberlain family. They moved from France to England at somewhere in the mid-1500s. However, there's no written record to tell us who exactly is responsible for the design of the forceps. Peter Chamberlain had several sons, also named Peter, who were also doctors, so it's been very difficult to track the person who was actually responsible for this. The news of the Chamberlain's secret instrument spread rapidly when it was realized it could shorten the agony of labor by overcoming obstruction, and that a living baby was more often being extracted than a dead one. Traditional obstetric surgery, though, was confined within this system arising from the problem of obstructed birth, usually by the head, the use of craniotomy in those cases, and then the mother's subsequent fears of male practitioner. And like I mentioned, in a typical emergency, the doctor wouldn't be called until the baby was dead and asked to perform a craniotomy, and there's no wonder women were a little scared. However, there were cases in which, the baby might still be alive and the doctor might be able to use this new instrument and perform a miracle. And if this event made the surgeon happy, you can only imagine what effect it would have had on the mother. And slowly, things started moving along. Mothers who had witnessed a doctor use the forceps started telling other mothers and comforting them that maybe it wasn't so bad as they thought, and there were really no reasons to be scared of it. And in such cases, the doctor started being called a little earlier than it was before. They weren't waiting 3 days. Now they were calling the doctor after half a day. In the 19th century, though, skills were still varied and rather imprecise. But that's not to say they were always bad. And many physicians, like their other midwives, conducted their practices to the best of their abilities because they had the mother's health in mind. What the forceps did, however, is it brought a discontinuity, a radical break with the past. And its effects are contained by two important boundaries. First of all, as different as this new practice was, it was rooted in the realm it superseded, that of obstetric surgery. Secondly, it may look like the forceps displayed the midwife, but that is not always the case. For all of its effects, the forceps was not the key into the lying room. It definitely did not confer on the male practitioner the role of acting instead of a midwife. And there's really no sign to see that the doctors had that ambition. Reading through journals and diaries and newspaper articles, we do see doctors that were not incredibly supportive of midwives, but there was no strong opposition. For forceps practice remained an emergency procedure. What the forceps dictated instead was not the displacement of a midwife, but this new balance between midwives and doctors. So I've talked briefly about changing birth attendants and some of the technological developments that came with that. And one of the results of that was changing expectations. When physicians started attending normal labors and deliveries and standards of excellence started to change, women faced this dilemma. Women who were accustomed to having female attendants had to decide whether they wanted to retain their traditional ways of delivery or if they wanted to invite a doctor into their homes. In the 19th century, financial status played an important part. Not a lot of women could afford to call a doctor. It was still reserved to the upper classes. But modesty being less important than safety, women opted for physicians because they represented science and knowledge and because they truly believed that was the safest way they could deliver their babies. As the 19th century progressed and physician-directed obstetrics became increasingly more acceptable among the ones who could afford it, the decision for women who were concerned with modesty and wanted to maintain traditional ways of birth became increasingly difficult, especially after the introduction of anesthesia, which promised to relieve all the pains of labor. When male medicine entered the birthing room, it entered on tiptoe. Men who were comfortable in the sick room, who believed that they had something to offer to women, knew that they were tending women in their homes in a world very much of their making. Women, because they still felt like they had options, they retained an element of power in their confinements. As a result, men learned to fit into the women's environment, knowing that they might not be invited to come back or might even be invited to leave. And they learned to be flexible in their recommendations, and also they modified their instructions based on the desires of the woman as well as her friends who were attending the delivery. Men did not make significant changes to women's birthing experiences until women invited them to do so. Although women accepted more and more of what medicine had to offer, indeed accepted the promises of science, they retained the ability to pick and choose whatever worked best for them, whether it was a midwife or it was a doctor. Another really important aspect that affected not only midwives but this whole culture of birth in general was the emergence of a new female culture. And I briefly talked about this new culture of the ladies. And doctors managed to take charge of women's birthing experiences because the sphere in which childbirth was happening was starting to change. The traditional role of the midwife was embedded within this collective culture, and it was the ceremony of childbirth that conveyed this incredible power upon the midwife. What gave the ritual its immense power was the fact that every woman participated in it, and they were all sharing the same experiences. And surely the midwife could have only been displaced if this general culture of women was slowly starting to change. In fact, there are grounds for believing that the old culture did break up. Wealthy mothers started to detach themselves from their humbler sisters and to construct this new identity. We start seeing the older oral traditional culture and all of a sudden this new culture of women who were literate, who were learning how to read, who wanted to sit in the parlor and draw and maybe not do farm work. And these are also the women who could afford to ask a doctor, and they could afford to get the newest technology and whatever new trend. And the male practitioner was a midwife who was not really a midwife. And the midwife, by her very presence, was a reminder to these women that they're exactly like their humbler sisters. There's no difference between the wife of a dairy farmer and an upper-class lady when it came to giving birth. But they felt that the doctor offered proof of their superior social status. But in the 19th century, the option of calling a physician was limited to those who could afford it. And in the second half of the 19th century, once hospitals start being founded, we see only poor women who were not able to gather the support they needed, and also single moms go to hospitals to deliver, and either with the help of a doctor or sometimes a midwife. Throughout the 19th century, the decision of whether or not to employ the skill of a physician remained with women where it had been in the past. Despite the strength of tradition, however, the birth experience and thus the birth culture around it started to change for the women who invited physicians into their homes. And these women were in the minority in the 19th century, and they were limited geographically and economically to the advantaged class. Most women still could not afford to pay a doctor's fee and still relied on midwives or grandmothers. Middle-class women, though, realized that fate no longer held them in such a tight grip, and that decisions and actions could be taken in order to ensure that the baby would be delivered healthy and happy. This mental perception of the ability to shape the birth experience became even more important in the second half of the 19th century, with anesthesia being the latest trend. Physicians offered women relief for suffering and aided others through difficult labors, but because of the variations in ability and practices of birth attendants, most women still continued to suffer extreme pain and to really fear childbirth. And the presence of some of the modern technology altered parts of the women's birth experience, but we still see women retaining some of the previous traditional forms. So they were still calling in their neighbors or their friends or their families or whoever was available to come help them. Women retained a lot of power in their homes, and physicians listened to them, or they would risk potentially losing patients. The next major step was the move from the private sphere to the public. In the 20th century, birth basically moved from the home to the hospital. In the 19th century, most hospitals had been started as charity institutions designed to care for the poor. As a result, there were not many of them. In 1890, for all of Ontario, there were only 20 public general hospitals for 15 communities, but by 1922, Ontario had 121 hospitals, including 10 sanatoria for consumptives, and in 1944, it had 116 general and 25 Red Cross. Hospital use increased because at last science, following the bacteriological and surgical revolution, had something to offer. People flocked to take advantage of the expertise of the new medical scientists. And an important part of this explanation is rightly placed in the realm of scientific advantages. To understand why women wanted to go to the hospital in the 20th century, we must take into account two other factors aside from safety. First, there was increased mystification of medical knowledge. Not a lot of women or people in general were understanding what was happening post the discovery that infections can be taken care of. And the second factor is this declining ability of women to help other mothers. Women started working full-time. They went into factory work. They no longer had 3 days to help their neighbor or cousin during their labor, and or also another week to help her feed her husband and children. It was just no longer possible. Not to mention the fact that all of a sudden, for a mom who maybe had several kids at home, the thought of going to a safe place where there were experts, infection could be taken care of, and she would just go deliver her baby and it would be safe and comfortable. That had an incredible appeal for many, many women. Once medicine successfully combated infection and hemorrhages, which were the two main sources of maternal death, by the middle of the 20th century, birthing was finally the safest it had ever been. And with this major increase in safety, women can now return and focus on the psychological aspect of the experience. And this is when the natural childbirth movement starts happening, and also other alternate movements. The Lamaze lessons started becoming popular. Dr. Lamaze started teaching women about other ways of delivering. And they mostly represent women's effort to retrieve some of the decision-making control over their confinements, an element that they felt like it was missing from their early 20th century hospital experience. The rebirth of midwifery in Canada is credited to about the late 1970s, like in many areas in North America, and it stemmed from a consumer backlash against what it's been called a medicalized childbirth, and this was mostly promoted by the home birth movement. Proponents of this movement stated that birth was a natural event, that women could do it themselves with help, of course, and that it could happen in a familiar environment at home. It was not a medicalized event. and challenging scientific discourse, women attempted to reclaim some of the means of reproduction and to take control of their birthing experience. In Ontario, the culmination of this movement came in 1993 when the province legalized midwifery and it fully incorporated it into the healthcare system. Now, following the Dutch model, Ontario midwives were able to work in a home setting, in a hospital, and also in a birth center. This also meant the introduction of university programs, in most cases 4-year intensive programs. And yes, midwifery underwent a decline, and it was without legal status in Canada for about a century, even though Canada was one of the last industrialized countries to legalize midwifery. And in the late 70s and early 80s, community midwifery emerged as more of a social movement that was devoted to explore a low-tech approach to birth and a women-centered alternative to standard care. Ideologically, this new midwifery, or post-midwifery, how it's been referred to in the literature, sought to restore some of the definition of childbirth as a natural event and to reinvent women as competent birthers and attendants who wanted to restore birthing to a more comfortable environment. These new midwives were not handed an intact tradition. They redefined midwifery through their work and research according to the needs and norms of their new communities. This hybrid midwifery practice that evolved in the 1970s were basically a mixture of old art, modern science, and new age insight. So what I've presented is a brief overview, very brief, of some of the changes that have affected childbirth, from change in birth attendance to some technology that was introduced to some of the changes in women's culture to a change in location. My goal for this presentation and my research in general was not to present any heroes and villains. I didn't want to write a paper where I glorified midwives and talked about how difficult it was when doctors came onto the scene using forceps. Sure, it was difficult, and I also didn't just want to talk about doctors and their new instruments. I wanted to see how women fit into the picture. I wanted to see how women culture had changed and how it related to today's events. How did we get to a point where in 2012 women are asking for more midwives, they're asking to have access to midwifery or better hospital birth experience. And I hope I've made you at least a tiny bit more interested in midwives and doctors and the history of midwifery. Thank you. Before we get to any questions, if there are any, I would like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Jane Arrington, Dr. Pamela Peacock, and Dr. James Lowe. They were all incredibly helpful this summer. They provided tons of feedback and were able to answer my questions. And some of my coworkers, Jenny and Beatrice, who had to put up with me going into their offices to tell them about something amazing I had read about giving birth in the 19th century. So thank you so much.
Very much, Diana. As she has said, it's open for questions, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that you'd be happy to answer.
Yes, Pamela.
Okay, so as you just finished saying, one of your big goals was to look at this from the actual participants in the birth perspective. Yes. And I know at the beginning of your talk you again briefly went over some of the sources that you consulted in terms of diaries or journals. Can you speak a little bit to, I guess, more specifics on some of that, or the class or background of the women you were able to access from that, or what was one of those exciting stories you found in those journals or letters that you ran to Jenny with?
I read a lot of letters from, I guess this would have been mostly upper class women, that were writing to their sisters or their mothers, mostly lamenting the fact that they cannot get the people they would want at their birth, like women's urbanization, people started moving, you know, not everyone was living with their sisters and mothers and cousins in the same town. Now all of a sudden they started being removed from this support system. So in their letters you see them complaining that their mothers can come to their birth, or that so-and-so's cousin is busy and could only be there for 3 days. Or in some funny cases, I'd read a letter of someone saying that her attendant could only help her for 3.5 weeks, and then she had to go home. It's like, oh my goodness, wow! I bet it's a little different today. But yes.
You touched on the urban-rural divide and the difference between women of a certain class and women of other classes. But to what extent do you think that even after 1938, the urban-rural divide continued to define rather than birth experience in Canada?
I think at that point, in rural Canada, you still see midwives being used. I would say the 50s and the 60s is when things started to fully move into the hospital, but women, and for Canada, Nova Scotia retained some of the strongest midwifery presence because there were so many isolated communities that you couldn't get to a hospital or a doctor. You had to rely on someone in your community who had some sort of knowledge and experience. Yes?
Can you talk a bit more about how midwifery came to become regulated in Canada in more recent years? You mentioned the act that passed.
Yes.
And how did that issue become raised?
Started. Okay, let's see if I can get my dates right. In '86, the province of Ontario started looking into, during one of those let's look at the budget, let's look at what we can do better, and it started looking at some of the professions that were not regulated, midwifery being one of them. And around the same time, there were 2 court cases. One of them was out of BC. I can't remember what the second one was, but it was the case of a home birth where there had been complications and the baby had passed away. So there was an investigation, midwives were taken to court, and it became a public matter. All of a sudden everyone, I'm assuming a lot of people would have been surprised that midwifery wasn't illegal, it was in this gray area, midwifery could still be practiced, but it was not under any act, or it was not covered by any healthcare system. So we've got the 2 court cases plus the province of Ontario wanting to see what's been left to the sidelines. So they formed the Midwifery Task Force, and what the task force did is it looked at the number of midwives in Ontario, and they really looked at the states as an example, and Holland and England and France were really great examples, and they tried to model their recommendations. So what they ended up recommended in the early 90s was that midwifery be fully legalized, that it should be integrated in the healthcare system, and that university programs needed to be founded so you can have trained clinicians, basically. And midwives should have full access to hospitals and work with doctors. So that's some of the background. Yes?
I know your study was localized entirely to Ontario, but I'm wondering, can Ontario serve as a stand-in for the rest of Canada for midwifery? And maybe secondly, did you bump into anything about out-of-province care, how would midwives develop a different cultural divide like Quebec, for instance? If you could comment on that.
Yeah, Ontario does not represent all of Canada. To be perfectly honest, I had to, narrow my focus on something. Otherwise, this talk would have been 3 hours in my paper of 500 pages. But I know it was very different in Quebec because midwifery had started earlier and didn't seem to have such a hard time. Do you want to answer that question, Dr. Peacock?
Not entirely, but I know, like, in Quebec, so where I was born, like, for my birth, which was before 86, like, there was a midwife in the hospital with my mom, and that was, you know, not that my mom had to go and ask for that, like that, she was naturally.
That was the standard, yeah, it wasn't a big deal.
And the way my mom talks about, like, Quebec healthcare, like the social system generally, like, I think there is a sort of cultural difference in terms of the political thinking of care, and you know, that is probably rooted further back than you know, my expertise initially talks about. But I think that given the nature of Canadian healthcare, even though you know starting mid 20th century, that there would be very quite a lot of difference across.
Yeah, and with regards to like new midwifery, British Columbia was way ahead of Ontario with that. UC birth centers and the home birth movement was way stronger in BC before it was in Ontario. Yes.
So one of the reasons, or an economic reason, a group of professionals would want to become regulated by the government would be to prevent the barrier of entry for more people that want to service that market. Now, when midwifery was legalized or regulated in Ontario, I suspect that actually there was more usage of the service than before, which is counterintuitive from what I just said. So do you think that came as a result of the access to OHIP funding for the service, or from the legitimacy that a government seal of approval provides on the service? Where did that come from?
I think it was a little bit of both, and maybe it came, there was this awareness all of a sudden that midwives were an option. To be perfectly honest, I had no idea midwives were covered under OHIP until last year. And I mean, I don't think it was until, you know, it got the stamp of approval and more women, oh dear, found out about it that they thought this was actually a viable option for them.
I have a question for you, just a comment to that also, perhaps, is that even though there's been a resurgence, I believe the numbers in Kingston are still about 10% of births happen with midwives, and there's all sorts of political reasons for that. But like there's a resurgence, but it's still a pretty small resurgence in terms of overall. My question is about the movement from, you know, you're talking about physicians coming into people's homes where they may take control, where the women may take control, and then the choice of going into a hospital where, okay, it's great because it's clean and they can get away from the kids, but they also, I wonder how conscious the decision is to give up control at that point, because this is clearly a physician-dominated environment.
Right.
Or nurse-dominated environment.
Yes. It's hard to answer that question because I don't ever want to make women sound like they were, you know, dumb and had no idea that going to a hospital would mean that they no longer had control. But I think they knew what the implications were, and they weighed and yeah, I guess so.
I know.
Do you disagree about that?
No, well,
a little,
but I think that initially, I think they might not have known fully. I mean, if you haven't been in a hospital environment,
that's true.
Again, like, let's throw off my personal experience. When I was surprised, you know, my Nana was complete, like, she wasn't there for her birth, basically, right? She was in that time.
Yeah.
You know, she woke up and all of a sudden she had this really big, you know, baby in her. But she, like, by that point in the 50s, like, that was what she expected. And when I would talk to her now about, you know, do you feel like you were kind of cheated? She's like, oh no, I would do that again. Like, that was because by that point that had become that normative culture around her. But in the early 20th century, I'm not really.
That's a good point. Yeah.
You pull your hand back down.
Oh, well, I was just, it just reminded me, you had a picture of Doran up there, but you didn't make a comment on it. And if you've ever seen those early pictures, you know, you're sort of going, whoa, because it's just made to look like a home. So it was like the women were trying to get both the best of both worlds.
Yes.
Clean and safe, but very homey. So
Yeah,
but
homey
those
and
would have
help.
been wealthy ones,
Yes.
very small.
Well, that's not quite true.
No?
The Gore building, at the end of the 19th century, the leading cause of maternal mortality was infection. And the reason the Doran building was developed by Dr. Fenning was to provide a place in which antisepsis was maintained at a very high level. And in the 30 years that the Doran building operated, there wasn't a single death due to infection in patients delivered in the hospital. The vast majority of the patients who came into the Doran building were the poor, and because they didn't have any other choice. And at that point in time, I think that the underlying principle in regard to everything is that the thing that drives patient care and reproduction is the team affair. It involves multiple people, and it involves people who are totally committed to the outcome of both the mother and the child. And that can be done very well by midwives. It can be done very well by physicians. And I can tell you, it can be done very well by well-trained obstetric nurses. They played a very important role in the 20th century. And so the real issue is not who's doing it. The real issue is the knowledge and ability and skills and commitment of the people who are doing it. And that makes a big difference.
Last question.
Well, I was just wondering, speaking to that, if you had run across the unassisted birth movement, which I believe is something, I'm a physician, and there's at some of these conferences, there's another movement that happens that's further.
The unassisted?
Yeah, there's an unassisted
Interesting.
movement. It happens, it's something that's discussed that is not obviously condoned by either the community, I believe, or the medical community, but I was just wondering if you came across
No, actually I have not. And is it fairly self-explanatory?
said about the importance of having a skilled birth attendant.
Yes, whether it's a midwife or a doctor, yeah.
Or the taxi driver. Well, thank you very much for a fascinating talk and very clearly presented. I think that was great. Thank you.